There is a quiet moment that happens just before we look up, a pause where the noise of the day softens and the sky becomes something more than background. For most of human history, the sky was not scenery. It was memory, authority, and mystery suspended above us. Tonight, let your attention drift upward, not to search for answers, but to notice how often the human mind turns the unknown into meaning. When something unfamiliar appears in the sky, the human response is almost instinctive. Long before instruments or equations, people lifted their eyes and felt a mixture of curiosity and unease, sensing that whatever moved above them existed beyond their control. This instinct has not disappeared. It still lives quietly beneath modern language, beneath headlines, beneath the calm surface of explanation. The recent attention surrounding Three-Eye Atlas follows this same ancient rhythm, not because the object itself is extraordinary, but because our relationship with the sky has always been deeply psychological rather than purely observational. If you feel drawn to these quiet examinations of how memory and meaning move through time, you may choose to subscribe, not as a habit, but as a gentle return to this shared space where curiosity is slow and continuous. The sky has always functioned as an authority humans could not negotiate with. It delivered seasons, storms, eclipses, and comets without explanation or permission. Early societies did not separate observation from interpretation. To see something was already to ask what it meant. When a light moved differently, when a pattern broke, the event demanded a story. Not because people lacked reason, but because narrative was the only available structure for understanding forces that could not be touched. This tendency is not rooted in superstition alone. It emerges from pattern-seeking behavior, a fundamental trait of human cognition. The mind searches for continuity, for cause and effect, for reassurance that events are not random. When the sky changes, it disrupts the largest pattern humans know. The response is emotional before it is intellectual. Fear, awe, and curiosity arrive together, and storytelling becomes the bridge between them. Throughout history, celestial events were rarely recorded as neutral occurrences. They were remembered as omens, messages, or signs of transition. A comet was not simply an object with a trajectory. It was a marker of disruption because it appeared suddenly and vanished without explanation. An eclipse was not merely a shadow, but a temporary failure of order. These interpretations were not errors. They were emotional translations, shaped by survival instincts and the need to anchor experience within a shared framework. What we are witnessing with Three-Eye Atlas today is not a return to ancient thinking, but a continuation of it. Media narratives, online speculation, and accelerated interpretation all mirror the same process that once unfolded around campfires and temple walls. Information now travels faster, but the underlying mechanism remains unchanged. We observe, we speculate, and eventually, we tell stories that feel large enough to hold our uncertainty. This is where myth begins, not as fiction, but as compression. Myths do not preserve precise data. They preserve impact. They carry the emotional weight of an event long after its physical details are forgotten. Over generations, accuracy gives way to meaning, and meaning becomes more durable than fact. In this way, celestial myths are not records of the sky itself, but records of how the sky made humans feel. Understanding this pattern does not require dismissing ancient stories or modern reactions. It invites a quieter perspective. The sky has always been a mirror, reflecting not only what moves above us, but how we respond when certainty slips away. As we continue to watch Three-Eye Atlas and similar events, we are not just observing the cosmos, we are observing ourselves, repeating a behavior as old as memory itself, and carrying it forward without fully realizing why. That repetition, carried forward without conscious intention, is what transforms simple observation into collective memory. Once an event enters shared awareness, it no longer belongs to the sky alone. It becomes social. It spreads through conversation, ritual, and interpretation, shaped subtly each time it is retold. Over time, the original stimulus fades, while the emotional response grows clearer and more defined. This is how celestial events stop being moments and begin becoming narratives. The human mind does not remember evenly. It remembers selectively, prioritizing what feels threatening, transformative, or meaningful. When something unusual appears overhead, the reaction is rarely neutral. Even curiosity carries tension, because the sky represents forces that cannot be negotiated with. Weather, darkness, light, and motion arrive without asking permission. In early societies, this lack of control made the sky the ultimate authority, a realm where causes were hidden and outcomes were unavoidable. Because of this, celestial events were often interpreted through existing emotional frameworks. A society experiencing stability might see a comet as a reminder of renewal or divine presence. A society under stress might interpret the same phenomenon as warning or judgment. The sky itself did not change, but the internal landscape of the observers did. Myth emerged at the intersection of external stimulus and internal condition. This is why myths differ so widely across cultures while still sharing common structures. Fires fall from the heavens. Gods move among the stars. Serpents, wheels, ladders, and eyes appear in the sky. These images are not technical descriptions. They are symbolic containers shaped to hold fear, awe, and uncertainty in forms the human mind can revisit without becoming overwhelmed. Symbolism allows memory to survive without precision. In this sense, myth functions less like a record and more like a compression algorithm. Details are stripped away, while emotional intensity is preserved. What remains is a story that can be carried forward orally, repeated across generations, and adapted to new contexts without losing its core impact. The event itself becomes secondary. The feeling it produced becomes primary. Modern society often assumes that this process belongs to the past, that with scientific language and data, we no longer mythologize the sky. Yet the reaction surrounding Three-Eye Atlas suggests otherwise. The language may be different, framed in speculation, probability, and commentary, but the emotional undercurrent is familiar. There is anticipation, anxiety, fascination, and the rapid construction of narrative possibilities that extend far beyond what is currently known. Digital platforms accelerate what once took generations. Stories form within hours. Interpretations multiply. The unknown is filled quickly, not because certainty exists, but because silence is uncomfortable. Where ancient cultures used gods and symbols, modern culture uses headlines, threads, and theories. The tools have changed, but the cognitive impulse remains intact. This does not mean myths are false or obsolete. It means they are human. They are evidence of how the mind copes with scale, uncertainty, and lack of control. When faced with the vastness of the sky, humans instinctively translate it into something relational, something that feels connected to their own lives and choices. The sky becomes personal, even when it is indifferent. As attention continues to circle around objects like Three-Eye Atlas, it becomes clear that we are not simply watching space. We are participating in a familiar cycle, one where observation slowly transforms into story, and story becomes a mirror of collective psychology. Understanding this cycle does not end it. It only makes it visible, inviting us to notice how easily meaning forms and how quietly myth begins to take shape. That quiet formation of meaning is rarely deliberate. It happens gradually, beneath awareness, shaped by repetition rather than intention. As stories circulate, they begin to stabilize. Certain phrases are repeated. Certain interpretations feel more satisfying than others. Over time, these favored explanations gain weight, not because they are more accurate, but because they resonate emotionally. This is how collective agreement begins to form around events that remain fundamentally uncertain. In ancient cultures, this stabilization happened through oral tradition. A single celestial event might be witnessed by many, but remembered through a few voices. Those voices carried responsibility. They shaped how the event would be understood by those who never saw it themselves. Memory passed from generation to generation, not as raw observation, but as curated experience. Each retelling filtered the event through cultural values, fears, and expectations. What survived was not chronology, but significance. Myths were never concerned with precise timing or physical mechanics. They were concerned with impact. They answered a different question than science does. Not what happened, but what did it mean for us? In doing so, they preserved emotional truth even as literal accuracy dissolved. This distinction is often misunderstood in modern interpretations of ancient stories. When people today encounter myths describing fire from the sky or beings descending from above, the instinct is to evaluate them as failed science, but that framing misses their purpose. These stories were not attempts to document the sky objectively. They were attempts to integrate overwhelming experiences into human understanding. The sky was too vast, too powerful, too unpredictable to be left uninterpreted. This same impulse can be observed in modern responses to celestial uncertainty. With 3-Eye Atlas, information gaps are quickly filled with speculation. Possibilities are layered onto one another, forming narratives that extend beyond available evidence. This is not irrational behavior. It is a continuation of an ancient coping mechanism. The mind prefers an imperfect explanation over unresolved ambiguity. The difference now lies in speed and scale. Where myths once took generations to settle into stable forms, modern narratives crystallize almost instantly. A theory emerges, gains attention, and becomes part of the shared story within days or even hours. Correction and refinement may follow, but the initial emotional imprint often remains stronger than later clarification. This reveals something important about how humans relate to knowledge. Understanding is not solely built on accuracy, it is built on coherence. A story that feels complete, even if speculative, often feels more satisfying than a fragmentary truth. This is why myths endure. They offer closure where reality does not. Recognizing this does not require rejecting modern science or dismissing ancient stories. It invites a layered perspective, one where scientific observation explains what moves through the sky, while myth explains how those movements settle into human consciousness. Both operate on different levels, addressing different needs. As we continue through the 3-Eye Atlas series, this distinction becomes increasingly relevant. What we are examining is not the object itself, but the human response surrounding it. The way attention gathers, narratives form, and meaning solidifies reveals more about us than about the sky. And in that reflection, we begin to see how every generation, regardless of its tools, participates in the same quiet transformation of observation into story. That transformation continues even after the initial excitement fades. Long after the headlines move on and attention shifts elsewhere, the emotional residue remains. What lingers is not the data, but the impression. People remember how the moment felt, how it disrupted routine, how it briefly reoriented attention toward something larger. Over time, this residue becomes the foundation upon which future interpretations are built. This is why similar celestial events often trigger familiar reactions, even when circumstances differ. The mind does not approach each event as entirely new. It draws from stored emotional templates, quietly asking whether this feels like something remembered. When enough similarities align, the response activates almost automatically. Concern, fascination, speculation. The cycle resumes with little conscious effort. In ancient societies, this process created continuity across generations. A child hearing a story about a comet or eclipse was not simply learning about the sky. They were inheriting a response pattern. The story taught them how to feel when the sky behaved unexpectedly. In this way, myth functioned as emotional education, preparing people for uncertainty long before it appeared again. The sky then became a shared psychological space, not owned by any one person, but interpreted collectively. Its movements were discussed, debated, ritualized, and remembered. Over centuries, these interpretations layered upon one another, forming complex mythological systems that reflected not just isolated events, but accumulated human experience. Modern culture often assumes it has outgrown this need, that access to real-time data has replaced myth with understanding. Yet moments like the public response to Three-Eye Atlas suggest otherwise. The same emotional architecture is still in place. What has changed is the language used to express it. Where ancient people spoke of gods and omens, modern audiences speak of probabilities, risks, and possibilities. But beneath the terminology, the same desire for coherence remains. This is why myths are not false stories. They are stories shaped by fear, survival, and memory. They are attempts to make sense of experiences that exceed ordinary scale. The sky represents the ultimate scale problem. It is vast, indifferent, and beyond direct influence. Myth brings it closer, translating distance into narrative. Understanding this helps explain why celestial myths appear across every culture, regardless of geography or era. Different names, different symbols, but similar structures. Something appears. It disrupts expectation. Meaning is assigned. The event is remembered not as it was, but as it was felt. This pattern is not accidental. It is human. As we continue examining Three-Eye Atlas, it becomes clear that the object itself matters less than the response it generates. The true subject is not orbit or composition, but interpretation. How quickly we move from observation to story reveals how deeply ingrained this behavior is. The sky may change, but the human response remains remarkably consistent, carrying ancient habits quietly into the present moment. That consistency across time suggests that myth is not a primitive error, but a stable feature of human cognition. It arises wherever uncertainty meets significance. When an event feels important but cannot be fully explained, narrative fills the gap. This does not happen because people lack information, but because information alone does not satisfy emotional needs. Meaning requires structure, and stories provide it. In anthropology, this pattern is often observed in how societies respond to rare or disruptive events. The less frequently something occurs, the more likely it is to be remembered symbolically rather than analytically. A yearly cycle becomes routine. A once-in-a-lifetime event becomes sacred. Celestial phenomena, by their nature, often fall into this second category. Their rarity amplifies their psychological impact. This helps explain why ancient myths often compress long periods into single moments. A flood becomes one story. A falling star becomes one message. The complexity of reality is simplified, not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. The human mind cannot carry infinite detail across generations. It carries essence instead. In the modern era, we see a similar compression occurring at a different scale. With Three-Eye Atlas, countless data points, observations, and expert analyses exist simultaneously. Yet public attention gravitates towards simplified narratives. Is it dangerous? Is it unusual? Does it change anything? These questions reduce complexity into emotionally manageable forms. The process mirrors ancient myth-making, even though the context feels entirely different. Media plays a central role in this acceleration. Stories are framed to capture attention, emphasizing novelty and implication. Subtlety struggles to survive in this environment. As a result, interpretation often runs ahead of verification. This is not necessarily manipulation. It is the natural outcome of combining human psychology with rapid information exchange. What matters most in this process is not whether the story is correct, but whether it feels complete. A complete story provides relief from uncertainty. It allows the mind to settle. This is why corrections rarely erase initial impressions. Once an emotional narrative takes hold, it becomes resistant to revision. Myth, once formed, has momentum. This does not mean modern narratives will persist for thousands of years in their current form, but the emotional patterns they establish may. Future generations may not remember the details of Three-Eye Atlas, but they may inherit the same instinctive reactions to unfamiliar objects in the sky. The cycle will continue, shaped by new language and new tools. Recognizing this pattern invites a different way of listening to both ancient myths and modern discourse. Instead of asking whether a story is true or false, we can ask what need it is responding to: fear, curiosity, identity, control. These needs do not disappear with technological progress. They adapt. As we move deeper into this examination, the focus shifts away from the sky itself and toward the human mind that watches it. The stars do not demand stories. Humans do. And in that demand, we reveal not weakness, but continuity, a long inheritance of meaning-making that quietly connects us to every generation that has ever looked up and wondered what it was seeing. That inheritance of meaning-making is subtle, often unnoticed, yet it shapes perception long before conscious thought intervenes. By the time an unfamiliar object is identified, measured, and categorized, the emotional response has already taken root. The feeling arrives first. Language follows later. This sequence is ancient, and it explains why rational explanations rarely erase initial reactions. They arrive after the mind has already begun organizing experience into story. In early cultures, this ordering was openly acknowledged. Emotion and meaning were not separated from observation. To witness the sky was to engage with it personally. The boundary between internal response and external event was thin. When something unusual appeared, it was understood as relational, something happening not just above humanity, but to humanity. Over time, this relational framing became embedded in cultural memory. Stories passed down were not neutral accounts. They were instructions. They taught listeners how to interpret disruption, how to emotionally position themselves when certainty faltered. In this way, myths served as psychological tools, offering continuity in a world that often felt unpredictable. Modern frameworks tend to deny this function, favoring objectivity and distance. Yet distance itself can feel destabilizing. When phenomena like Three-Eye Atlas appear in public awareness, the technical explanations often coexist uneasily with emotional responses. Data may describe trajectories and probabilities, but it does not address the deeper question that quietly surfaces. What does this mean for us? This question is rarely asked explicitly, but it underlies much of the surrounding conversation. Speculation, debate, and interpretation are not simply about facts. They are attempts to restore a sense of orientation. The unknown creates psychological imbalance. Narrative works to correct it. What changes across time is not the impulse, but the vocabulary. Ancient myths spoke in symbols drawn from nature and society. Modern narratives borrow from science, technology, and risk assessment, yet both serve the same purpose. They translate scale into something the human mind can hold. This is why attempts to fully separate myth from modern thought often fail. Myth is not confined to the past. It is an ongoing process. Whenever an event exceeds everyday experience, the mind reaches for familiar structures to contain it. The sky, vast and indifferent, continues to provide such moments. As attention moves on and certainty slowly replaces speculation around Three-Eye Atlas, the emotional imprint will remain. It will quietly influence how the next unfamiliar object is received. Each event leaves behind a trace, contributing to an evolving archive of collective feeling. Understanding this does not diminish scientific knowledge. It complements it. Science explains mechanisms, myth explains meaning. One addresses how the universe behaves. The other addresses how humans live within it. Both persist because they answer different questions. As this chapter continues, the focus narrows further, away from individual events and toward the patterns they reveal. The sky becomes a constant backdrop, while human interpretation moves into the foreground. What emerges is not a story about celestial objects, but about the enduring ways humans respond when the familiar order briefly opens and something unknown passes overhead. That moment when the familiar order opens is often brief, but its effects stretch far beyond the event itself. For a short time, attention lifts upward, routines loosen, and perspective shifts. People speak differently. They listen more closely. The ordinary rhythm of life is interrupted by a reminder of scale. Even when the interruption is subtle, it leaves a mark. In ancient societies, these moments were often absorbed into ritual. Ritual did not explain the sky, but it stabilized the community beneath it. By repeating gestures, words, and symbols, people created continuity in the face of uncertainty. The sky could not be controlled, but the response to it could be shared. This shared response reduced fear and transformed isolation into belonging. Today, ritual takes different forms. It appears as collective discussion, repeated imagery, and synchronized attention. When an object like Three-Eye Atlas enters public awareness, millions of individuals engage with it simultaneously, even if silently, reading the same headlines, watching the same visuals, considering the same questions. This synchronization echoes ancient gatherings, though it unfolds across screens rather than open ground. What remains consistent is the emotional function. These shared moments reassure individuals that they are not alone in their uncertainty. Meaning becomes communal. Even disagreement plays a role because it confirms engagement. Silence, more than confusion, is what the human mind resists. Over time, however, attention drifts back downward. Daily life resumes. The sky returns to background. Yet the episode does not vanish completely. It settles into memory as a reference point. The next time something unfamiliar appears, it will be compared, consciously or not, to what came before. This comparison shapes reaction, expectation, and interpretation. In this way, each generation inherits not only stories, but thresholds. Thresholds of surprise, fear, and fascination. What once felt overwhelming may later feel ordinary. What once inspired myth may eventually inspire only passing interest. But the underlying process remains active, adjusting continuously to experience. This gradual adjustment explains why myths evolve rather than remain static. They are revised, reinterpreted, and sometimes forgotten, but their function persists. They adapt to new environments, new knowledge, and new anxieties. The sky remains the same, but the human relationship to it shifts with context. With Three-Eye Atlas, we are observing this adaptation in real time. The language surrounding it reflects modern concerns, modern frameworks, and modern sensibilities. Yet beneath the surface, the emotional architecture is familiar. Curiosity mixed with unease, wonder tempered by analysis, story shaped by uncertainty. As this examination moves forward, the focus begins to widen again. Individual reactions give way to broader patterns. Across centuries and cultures, the same behaviors repeat with slight variations. The sky triggers attention. Attention generates meaning. Meaning becomes memory. What emerges is not a warning or a revelation, but a quiet insight. Humans do not turn celestial events into myths because they misunderstand the sky. They do so because they are trying to understand themselves within it. That attempt at self-understanding is often subtle, unfolding beneath awareness rather than through deliberate reflection. When people look up, they are not only observing distance and motion, they are measuring their own place within a larger order. The sky has always offered a scale that human life cannot match, and in doing so, it quietly challenges assumptions of control and permanence. Across cultures, this challenge has been met in similar ways. Stories emerge that reframe the sky as communicative rather than indifferent. Lights become messages, movements become intentions. By attributing meaning to celestial events, societies soften the psychological distance between themselves and the cosmos. The unknown becomes at least partially relational, something that can be spoken about rather than silently endured. This does not mean people believed they fully understood the sky. On the contrary, myth often acknowledges mystery more openly than modern language does. Symbols and metaphors allow space for ambiguity. They accept that not everything can be resolved. In this way, myth can be seen as an honest response to uncertainty, one that prioritizes emotional stability over factual completeness. Modern discourse sometimes struggles with this balance. There is pressure to explain quickly, to resolve ambiguity, to offer conclusions even when evidence is incomplete. When events like 3I Atlas capture attention, this pressure becomes visible. Explanations multiply, each attempting to close the gap between observation and understanding. Yet the gap rarely closes entirely. What remains unresolved is not a failure of knowledge, but a reminder of scale. The universe does not operate on human timelines or emotional needs. It moves according to forces that existed long before observation and will continue long after it. This realization can feel unsettling, but it can also be grounding. It places human experience within a broader continuity. Myths, in their own way, perform this grounding function. They connect individual lives to larger patterns, even when the connections are symbolic rather than literal. They remind listeners that others before them have faced the same sense of smallness, the same questions, the same desire for meaning when confronted with the sky. As the focus of this series continues to shift, the emphasis moves away from whether myths are accurate descriptions of celestial events. Instead, attention turns toward what they reveal about human psychology. The patterns of response, the repetition of themes, and the persistence of narrative all point to a shared cognitive heritage. With each unfamiliar object that passes overhead, that heritage quietly activates. Observation becomes interpretation. Interpretation becomes story. And story becomes a way of carrying uncertainty without being overwhelmed by it. In the chapters ahead, this perspective will widen further, stepping back from individual events like 3I Atlas to consider what this recurring behavior ultimately tells us. Not about the sky itself, but about how humans, across time, have learned to live beneath it. That shared cognitive heritage becomes clearer when we step back far enough to see repetition across eras, rather than isolated moments. From ancient observers tracking the movement of stars to modern audiences refreshing live updates, the behavior follows a recognizable arc. Attention rises, meaning is assigned, memory forms. The cycle repeats, quietly reinforcing itself with each new generation. What changes most noticeably over time is not the response itself, but the framework used to contain it. Early societies relied on oral tradition, ritual, and symbolic language to hold collective memory together. These tools were effective not because they were precise, but because they were adaptable. They allowed stories to survive changes in environment, leadership, and belief without losing emotional coherence. As civilizations developed writing, myth gained permanence. Stories carved into stone or inked onto parchment became reference points, stabilizing interpretation across longer spans of time. Yet even then, the purpose remained the same. These records were not neutral logs of observation. They were cultural anchors designed to preserve meaning rather than measurement. The sky played a central role in this preservation because it offered repetition with variation. The sun rose and set reliably, reinforcing order. But occasionally, something disrupted that order. A comet appeared. An eclipse darkened the day. A star behaved unexpectedly. These disruptions stood out sharply against the backdrop of regularity, making them ideal carriers of memory. Psychologically, rare events leave deeper impressions than common ones. The mind prioritizes what breaks expectation. This is why myths cluster around anomalies rather than routines. No stories are told about ordinary sunsets. Stories emerge when the pattern breaks, when the familiar rhythm falters and demands attention. In the modern context, this prioritization is amplified rather than diminished. Constant exposure to information has raised the threshold of novelty, yet true anomalies still cut through. When something like 3-eye Atlas enters awareness, it momentarily interrupts the steady flow of the expected. Even those who understand the scientific explanations feel the interruption on a quieter level. This interruption invites interpretation because it creates a gap, a space where routine understanding pauses. Into that space, narrative naturally flows. Some narratives are cautious, others speculative, but all serve the same function. They fill the silence left by uncertainty. Over time, societies learn from these moments. They refine their responses, adjusting expectations and emotional thresholds. What once inspired fear may later inspire curiosity. What once felt supernatural may become familiar. Yet the underlying mechanism does not disappear. It simply recalibrates. Seen from this distance, myth-making is not a relic of ancient ignorance, nor is it a flaw in modern thinking. It is a stable adaptive process. It helps humans navigate a world where not everything can be predicted or controlled. The sky, vast and indifferent, continually supplies opportunities for this process to activate. As this examination moves deeper, the question shifts again. Not why humans tell stories about the sky, but what those stories ultimately preserve. Not facts about celestial mechanics, but traces of how different generations felt when confronted with the same enduring unknown. Those preserved traces of feeling form a kind of emotional archive, layered quietly beneath history. When we read ancient myths today, we are not only encountering symbolic language, we are encountering echoes of lived experience, fear, wonder, humility, and curiosity compressed into narrative forms that could survive time. The sky becomes the medium through which these emotions were safely stored and transmitted. This perspective changes how we interpret the continuity of myth across cultures. Similar stories do not necessarily imply shared contact or identical events. They suggest shared cognitive responses. When humans encounter the same category of uncertainty, they tend to produce the same kinds of explanations. The sky offers a universal stimulus. It looks different depending on geography, but it always feels distant, powerful, and uncontrollable. Because of this, celestial myths often converge around a small set of themes: descent from above, cycles of destruction and renewal, messages delivered through light or movement. These themes are not technical observations. They are emotional constants. They reflect how it feels to live beneath something immense and indifferent, yet strangely intimate. In modern settings, these emotional constants still surface, though they are often disguised as analysis or debate. When attention gathers around 3-eye Atlas, the discussion frequently extends beyond what is strictly observable. Questions arise about origin, implication, and significance. Even when framed carefully, these questions reveal an underlying desire to place the event within a larger story. This desire does not disappear with education or expertise. Scientists themselves are not immune to narrative framing. Research papers may avoid metaphor, but public explanations often rely on it. Comparisons, analogies, and simplified models help translate scale into something comprehensible. These are not myths in the traditional sense, but they serve a related purpose. They bridge the gap between complexity and understanding. The difference lies in awareness. Modern frameworks often attempt to separate emotional response from factual explanation. Ancient myths did not make this distinction. Emotion was not seen as interference. It was part of perception itself. In some ways, this made ancient narratives more transparent about their function. They openly acknowledged the human presence in interpretation. Recognizing this helps soften the false divide between ancient and modern thought. The tools have changed, but the mind has not. When uncertainty appears, the same internal processes activate. The same need for coherence emerges. The same impulse to remember not just what happened, but how it felt. As attention continues to move forward in this series, the focus will widen beyond individual reactions and specific events. The goal is not to resolve the unknown, but to observe how humans consistently respond to it. In that observation, a quieter understanding takes shape, one that sees myth not as an error to be corrected, but as a mirror reflecting the enduring ways humans live beneath the sky. That mirror, reflecting human response rather than celestial mechanics, reveals patterns that remain remarkably stable over time. Each generation believes it is encountering the unknown for the first time, yet the emotional choreography is familiar. Attention narrows, language intensifies, meaning begins to cluster around the event. What feels unprecedented at the surface often follows a deeply ingrained script beneath it. This script is not written consciously. It emerges from the way human perception prioritizes relevance. The mind is constantly filtering information, deciding what matters and what can be ignored. The sky usually sits at the edge of awareness, stable enough to fade into background. When something disrupts that stability, it crosses an internal threshold. It becomes relevant in a way that demands interpretation. In ancient contexts, relevance was tied closely to survival. Changes in the sky could signal shifts in seasons, weather, or fortune. Even when no direct consequence followed, the potential alone was enough to justify attention. Over time, this vigilance became encoded into culture. Stories taught people what to notice and how to respond long before direct experience occurred. In modern life, survival rarely depends on reading the sky, yet the inherited sensitivity remains. When objects like 3i Atlas enter public awareness, they activate a response system that evolved for very different conditions. The body reacts before the intellect fully engages. Interest spikes. Imagination fills gaps. Only later does analysis attempt to restore balance. This sequence explains why emotional reactions often feel disproportionate to the event itself. The response is not calibrated solely to present conditions. It draws on accumulated memory, both personal and collective. The mind reacts not just to what is seen, but to what similar disruptions have meant in the past, even if those meanings are no longer consciously remembered. Over long periods, this layering of responses creates cultural momentum. Certain interpretations feel intuitive because they have been reinforced repeatedly across generations. Even when stripped of explicit mythological language, the structure remains. The sky is still perceived as a source of signals rather than noise. Unfamiliar motion still invites narrative rather than indifference. Understanding this does not require abandoning rational frameworks. It requires recognizing their limits. Rational explanation can describe trajectories and probabilities, but it does not fully address why attention gathers the way it does. It does not explain why some events resonate while others pass unnoticed. Those answers lie deeper in the architecture of perception itself. As this exploration continues, the emphasis shifts further inward, away from the objects that trigger response and toward the mechanisms that sustain it. What becomes clear is that celestial myths, ancient or modern, are less about the sky changing and more about humans noticing that change together. In that shared noticing, something subtle occurs. Individual uncertainty becomes collective experience. Fear softens into curiosity. Confusion becomes story, and through that story, the unknown becomes something that can be carried forward, remembered, and revisited when the sky once again does something unexpected. That ability to carry the unknown forward is one of the mind's most adaptive traits. Rather than demanding immediate resolution, humans learn to store uncertainty in narrative form. Stories act as containers, holding unanswered questions without forcing closure. This allows individuals and societies to move forward while keeping space for reflection and reinterpretation. In ancient cultures, this storage was deliberate. Myths were told and retold not to settle debate, but to keep memory alive. Each retelling invited subtle shifts in emphasis, allowing the story to evolve alongside the society that carried it. In this way, myth remained relevant without ever becoming fixed. Modern narratives behave similarly, though they often appear more rigid. With events like Three-Eye Atlas, early interpretations may later be refined or corrected, but the initial framing often persists in memory. First impressions leave strong traces, shaping how subsequent information is received. This is not a failure of reason, but a feature of how meaning is constructed. Psychologically, the mind favors continuity over accuracy when the two conflict. A story that maintains coherence feels safer than one that constantly revises itself. Myths excel at this because they are flexible without appearing unstable. They can absorb new details while preserving their core emotional structure. This flexibility explains why myths survive changes in knowledge. Scientific understanding may advance, but the emotional questions remain. Where do we come from? What lies beyond us? Are we alone? Celestial events intensify these questions by making the vastness of the universe momentarily present. They remind humans of their smallness, but also of their capacity to wonder. In contemporary culture, wonder often competes with distraction. Attention is fragmented, pulled in many directions at once, yet certain events still manage to gather focus. The sky retains this power because it operates outside everyday control. When something unfamiliar appears above, it interrupts even the most saturated attention landscape. With Three-Eye Atlas, this interruption may be brief, but it is enough to reveal the underlying process. For a moment, conversation slows. Perspective widens. People are reminded that their daily concerns exist within a much larger context. This momentary widening is precisely what myths have always facilitated. As this chapter unfolds, the role of myth becomes clearer. It is not about preserving belief in supernatural explanations. It is about preserving the human capacity to sit with uncertainty without collapsing into fear or indifference. Myth holds tension gently, allowing meaning to remain open-ended. This understanding prepares the ground for the final movement of the series. Having traced how celestial events become stories and how stories become memory, the next step is to ask what this process ultimately reveals. Not about the sky itself, but about the enduring patterns of human interpretation that continue to shape how we experience the present moment. That enduring pattern of interpretation becomes most visible when we compare how different eras describe the same kind of experience. Ancient observers spoke of gods, messengers, and signs. Modern observers speak of anomalies, probabilities, and models. Yet beneath the vocabulary, the emotional posture is strikingly similar. Both are attempts to stand in relation to something vast without being overwhelmed by it. This posture is shaped by a balance between humility and agency. The sky reminds humans of their limits, but interpretation restores a sense of participation. By telling stories, people insert themselves into the cosmic narrative. They are no longer passive witnesses, but interpreters of meaning. This shift is subtle, yet psychologically significant. In ancient myths, this participation often took the form of dialogue. The sky was believed to communicate, to respond, to act with intention. In modern discourse, the dialogue is internalized. People debate implications, share interpretations, and imagine outcomes. The sky may no longer be personified, but it still invites response. With Three-Eye Atlas, this invitation is visible in the way attention gathers around possibilities rather than certainties. Even when data is clear, speculation persists. This is not because facts are insufficient, but because facts alone do not satisfy the relational impulse. Humans want to know how an event fits into a larger story that includes themselves. This impulse is deeply rooted in social cognition. Meaning becomes more stable when it is shared. Discussing an event, even hypothetically, reinforces connection and reduces isolation. Ancient myths were communal by necessity. Modern narratives are communal by design. Both rely on collective engagement to sustain significance. Over time, repeated engagement creates familiarity. What was once disruptive becomes integrated into expectation. The sky slowly regains its place as background, yet the process leaves behind subtle changes. Thresholds shift, language adapts, new metaphors enter circulation. Each event contributes to a gradual reshaping of cultural perception. This reshaping is rarely acknowledged, but it accumulates. Centuries of celestial interpretation have influenced how humans think about time, fate, and continuity. The idea of cycles, of recurrence, of long durations beyond individual lifespans is rooted in watching the sky. Myth translated these observations into forms that could be carried emotionally. Modern science now provides precise measurements of these cycles, but the emotional resonance remains. Knowing the age of the universe does not eliminate the feeling of smallness. Calculating trajectories does not remove the sense of wonder. In this way, scientific understanding and mythic response coexist rather than replace one another. As this exploration moves forward, the emphasis begins to settle. The repeated pattern is no longer surprising. It becomes expected. Humans turn celestial events into myths because doing so helps them orient themselves within vastness. It is a response not to ignorance, but to scale. What remains to be considered is how this orientation influences the present, how inherited patterns shape modern interpretation, and how, even now, under familiar skies, ancient habits quietly guide the stories we tell ourselves when something unfamiliar passes overhead. That quiet guidance from inherited habits often goes unnoticed because it feels natural. The way attention rises, the way conversation forms, the way meaning is assigned, all seem spontaneous. Yet these responses have been practiced for thousands of years. They are part of a learned human rhythm, passed down not only through stories, but through shared ways of noticing and responding. This rhythm becomes especially clear when uncertainty intersects with visibility. Celestial events are public by nature. They appear above everyone, regardless of belief or background. This shared visibility creates a collective experience that few other phenomena can match. Even when people encounter the event indirectly, through images or reports, the sense of a common reference point remains. In ancient times, this shared reference was literal. Entire communities could gather and look up together. Today, the gathering is dispersed, but the synchronization persists. When Three-Eye Atlas enters discussion, people across the world engage with the same idea at roughly the same time. This creates a modern version of the communal gaze, one that operates through networks rather than physical proximity. The psychological effect is similar. Individual uncertainty becomes shared curiosity. Private questions become public conversation. Meaning is negotiated collectively, not imposed from above. This negotiation is where myth begins to take shape, even in a secular context. Not as doctrine, but as narrative consensus. Over time, certain interpretations gain prominence. They are repeated, refined, and circulated until they feel familiar. Familiarity brings comfort. Comfort reduces anxiety. In this way, myth functions as emotional regulation. It transforms the unknown into something that can be talked about without fear. This does not mean that all myths are soothing. Some amplify fear, reflecting the anxieties of the societies that produce them. But even fearful myths serve a purpose. They externalize anxiety, giving it form and language. Once named, fear becomes easier to manage. Modern responses to celestial events reveal this same dynamic. Speculation may feel chaotic at first, but patterns quickly emerge. Certain narratives dominate, others fade. The process is organic, shaped by emotional resonance rather than accuracy alone. Understanding this process invites a shift in perspective. Instead of viewing myth as a distortion of reality, it can be seen as a response to reality that prioritizes human needs. It does not replace observation, it accompanies it. As this chapter continues, the focus begins to move toward resolution, not a conclusion about Three-Eye Atlas itself, but an understanding of why such events reliably trigger the same sequence of responses. The sky remains constant. Human interpretation does not. In recognizing this, there is a quiet release. The need to decide whether myths are right or wrong gives way to a simpler insight. They are human. They arise where uncertainty meets attention. And as long as humans continue to look up, that meeting will continue to produce stories. That continuation of story-making does not depend on belief, only on attention. Whether an individual accepts a myth literally or symbolically is secondary. What matters is that the event was noticed, shared, and emotionally processed. In this way, myth operates beneath ideology. It functions regardless of worldview, quietly shaping how experience is absorbed. This is why even highly secular societies continue to generate myth-like narratives. The language may be technical, cautious, or provisional, but the structure remains familiar. An unusual object appears. Its origin is questioned. Its significance is debated. Possible futures are imagined. The sequence unfolds almost automatically, guided by inherited patterns of response. With Three-Eye Atlas, the discussion often circles back to the same themes seen throughout history. Where did it come from? What does it mean? Should we be paying attention? These questions echo ancient concerns, even when framed in modern terms. They reveal a continuity of curiosity that transcends cultural change. Importantly, this continuity does not imply stagnation. Each era adds its own layer of interpretation. Modern narratives are shaped by scientific literacy, media ecosystems, and global connectivity. Ancient myths were shaped by local environments, oral memory, and ritual practice. The form evolves, but the function persists. That function is orientation. When confronted with something unfamiliar, humans seek to locate themselves in relation to it. Stories provide coordinates. They answer not only what something is, but where it belongs within a broader understanding of the world. Without this orientation, experience remains fragmented. Celestial events are particularly potent in this regard because they resist easy placement. They exist beyond human scale, beyond daily routine, beyond immediate consequence. This resistance creates a vacuum that narrative naturally fills. Myth does not eliminate the vacuum, it makes it livable. As attention moves away from the specific details of Three-Eye Atlas, what remains is the pattern it illuminated, a brief convergence of curiosity, speculation, and shared reflection. These moments are easy to overlook once they pass, but they leave subtle traces in collective memory. Over time, these traces influence how future events are received. They adjust expectations, they shape language, they inform intuition. The next unfamiliar object will not be met in isolation. It will be met by a mind already conditioned by countless similar moments. Seen this way, myth is not a story about the past. It is a process unfolding continuously in the present. It adapts quietly, responding to each new disruption with familiar gestures. Look up. Notice, interpret, remember. As this exploration approaches its final movement, the emphasis shifts once more, away from explanation and toward reflection. What does this enduring pattern say about humanity? What does it reveal about how we live with uncertainty, scale, and time? These questions linger, not demanding answers, but inviting a deeper awareness of the stories we continue to tell beneath the sky. That deeper awareness often arrives quietly, not as realization, but as recognition, a sense that something familiar has been seen again, wearing a different shape. When humans observe how easily meaning gathers around events like Three-Eye Atlas, it becomes possible to notice the process itself rather than being fully carried by it. This noticing does not stop the story from forming, but it changes how tightly one holds it. Across history, moments of reflection like this have often followed periods of intense myth-making. After the story stabilizes, space opens for contemplation. People begin to ask not only what the event meant, but why it mattered so much in the first place. This secondary reflection is quieter, less dramatic, and often more revealing. In ancient cultures, such reflections sometimes emerged through philosophy or cosmology. Thinkers began to step back from the gods themselves and consider the order behind them. The sky remained meaningful, but meaning became more abstract. Cycles replaced personalities. Balance replaced intention. Myth slowly gave way to model, without fully disappearing. The modern world exists deep within this reflective phase, yet it still carries myth forward. The difference is subtle. Stories are no longer presented as absolute truths, but as possibilities, frameworks, or perspectives. This flexibility allows multiple interpretations to coexist, even when they contradict one another. What matters is not agreement, but engagement. With 3i Atlas, engagement itself became the defining feature. The object functioned as a focal point, gathering attention long enough for patterns of response to become visible. Once attention disperses, the object recedes, but the pattern remains, ready to reappear with the next disruption. This reveals an important insight. Humans are not primarily disturbed by the unknown. They are disturbed by unshared uncertainty. When uncertainty is held collectively, it becomes manageable. Stories provide the mechanism for that sharing. They allow individuals to participate in uncertainty together, rather than facing it alone. This may be one of the deepest reasons celestial events so reliably produce myth. The sky is universally shared, but its mysteries are not easily resolved. Story bridges that gap, transforming private unease into collective experience. In doing so, it reinforces social bonds as much as it preserves memory. Seen through this lens, myth is not merely a byproduct of observation. It is a social technology, one that evolved to help humans remain coherent in the face of forces far larger than themselves. The sky was simply the most consistent source of those forces. As the series moves toward its conclusion, this understanding reframes the entire discussion. The question is no longer why humans turn celestial events into myths. The question becomes how they could ever have done otherwise. To live beneath the sky is to live with scale, unpredictability, and continuity that exceeds any single life. Myth is one way humans have learned to carry that weight gently. And even now, in an age of data and distance, that ancient solution continues to surface, quietly guiding how meaning forms when something unfamiliar passes overhead. That quiet guidance continues even when people believe they are responding purely rationally. The language of probability, models, and projections feels detached, yet it still participates in the same underlying structure. It frames uncertainty in ways that can be discussed, shared, and emotionally tolerated. In this sense, modern explanation does not replace myth. It reshapes it. What often goes unnoticed is how strongly interpretation is influenced by timing. Celestial events that occur during periods of social stability tend to be absorbed calmly. Those that appear during moments of tension or transition are more likely to accumulate symbolic weight. The sky does not change its behavior, but the human context does, and meaning bends accordingly. Throughout history, this bending has been visible in the stories that survived. Periods of upheaval produced myths filled with warnings, judgments, and endings. Periods of relative peace produced myths of order, cycles, and renewal. The same kinds of events were interpreted through very different emotional lenses. Myth recorded not the sky, but the state of the observers beneath it. This remains true today. Reactions to 3i Atlas do not exist in isolation. They are shaped by broader cultural conditions, by collective stress, by rapid change, and by an underlying sense that the world itself is unstable. In such conditions, unfamiliar signals attract more attention. They feel heavier, more significant, even if their physical nature is well understood. This does not mean that people consciously assign cosmic meaning to modern events. Rather, emotional context amplifies interpretation. The unknown feels closer. The sky feels more present. Narrative expands to accommodate unspoken anxieties that have been waiting for expression. In this way, celestial events often act as projection surfaces. They provide a neutral canvas onto which human concerns can be mapped. Ancient societies projected gods, conflicts, and destinies. Modern societies project risk, transformation, and future consequence. The form changes, but the act of projection remains constant. Recognizing this projection does not invalidate the experience. It clarifies it. It shows that myth is less about belief in external forces and more about internal organization. It helps societies articulate what they are already feeling but have not yet named. As this chapter deepens, the focus shifts from myth as story to myth as function. What role does it play in maintaining psychological balance? How does it help individuals and groups navigate uncertainty without becoming overwhelmed? These questions lead naturally toward the closing movement of the series. Having traced the origins, mechanisms, and persistence of myth-making around the sky, what remains is to reflect on what this reveals about humanity itself, not as observers of the cosmos, but as meaning-making beings living within it, continually translating vastness into story so it can be carried, shared, and remembered. That translation of vastness into story is not something humans ever finish. It is an ongoing adjustment, refined with each generation. As knowledge expands, the unknown retreats in some areas and deepens in others. The sky becomes more measured, yet also more expansive. Distances grow, time scales stretch. The sense of mystery does not disappear. It changes texture. In ancient worlds, the mystery of the sky was immediate and intimate. Lights moved without explanation. Darkness arrived unexpectedly. The heavens felt close enough to speak to. Today, the mystery is abstract, layered in numbers too large to visualize and forces too distant to imagine directly. Yet abstraction does not reduce emotional impact. In some ways, it intensifies it. When people encounter concepts like interstellar distance or deep time, the mind responds in ways similar to ancient awe. There is a brief destabilization, a recognition of smallness. Events like 3I Atlas bring this abstraction into focus. They offer a tangible reference point, something specific that can be named, discussed, and placed within the vastness. This is why such events attract disproportionate attention. They act as anchors for imagination. Without them, the scale of the universe remains theoretical. With them, it becomes momentarily concrete. A single object stands in for an incomprehensible whole. Story gathers around it because story is how humans work with scale. Over time, these anchor points accumulate. Each one adds to a growing internal map of the cosmos, not in terms of coordinates, but in terms of remembered reactions. The mind learns what it feels like to confront vastness repeatedly. Familiarity develops, not with the universe itself, but with the emotional process of facing it. This familiarity can be mistaken for indifference. In reality, it is adaptation. Humans learn how to experience awe without becoming paralyzed by it. Myth has always played a role in this adaptation. It provides continuity, allowing the feeling of wonder to persist without overwhelming daily life. Modern narratives serve a similar function. They allow people to engage with cosmic scale briefly, then return to ordinary concerns. The story contains the experience, giving it boundaries. Without those boundaries, the weight of vastness would be difficult to integrate. As this exploration moves closer to its end, the emphasis settles on this adaptive quality. Humans do not mythologize the sky because they are confused by it. They do so because they are capable of holding both knowledge and wonder at the same time. In this light, 3I Atlas is less an object of significance than a reminder that even now, beneath layers of data and explanation, the same ancient processes continue to shape how meaning forms. The sky still interrupts. Attention still gathers. Story still follows. What remains is to consider what this continuity offers, not answers about the universe, but insight into the human condition. A species that has always lived beneath the same sky, learning, adapting, and quietly telling itself stories so that the vastness above can be carried without fear. That capacity to carry vastness without fear may be one of humanity's most understated achievements. It is not taught formally, nor is it celebrated openly, yet it shapes how societies endure across long stretches of time. By turning overwhelming scale into shared narrative, humans transform what could be paralyzing into something livable. The sky does not become smaller, but it becomes familiar. This familiarity is not the same as understanding. One can feel at ease beneath the stars without knowing their distances or compositions. What matters is the relationship, not the data. Ancient myths cultivated this relationship through personification and ritual. Modern narratives cultivate it through explanation and context. Both approaches create a sense of orientation, a feeling that the cosmos, while vast, is not entirely alien. When attention gathers around Three-Eye Atlas, this orientation is briefly renegotiated. People revisit questions that usually remain dormant. How much is happening beyond our notice? How often do unseen objects pass by? What does it mean to live on a small world in constant motion? These questions are not new. They have surfaced repeatedly, each time framed by the language of the era. What differs now is awareness of repetition. Many people sense, consciously or not, that they are participating in a familiar cycle. The stories form quickly, but so does reflection on why they form at all. This self-awareness introduces a new layer to myth-making. The process becomes partially visible to itself. This visibility does not end the process. It adds depth to it. Humans can observe their own responses while still experiencing them. Awe and analysis coexist. Curiosity persists alongside restraint. The story becomes quieter, more measured, but it does not disappear. In this way, modern myth is often subtle. It may never solidify into a single narrative or symbol. Instead, it exists as a shared atmosphere of meaning, a temporary alignment of attention and interpretation. It fades gently rather than being replaced. This gentleness reflects a shift in how uncertainty is managed. Where ancient myths often sought permanence, modern narratives accept impermanence. They allow stories to dissolve once their emotional work is done. The goal is not to preserve the event forever, but to integrate its impact. As this integration completes, daily life resumes its rhythm. The sky returns to background. Yet something has changed, even if only slightly. The internal map has been adjusted. The next encounter with the unknown will be met with this adjustment already in place. Approaching the final phase of this exploration, the emphasis rests on this quiet continuity. Across eras, technologies, and beliefs, humans have found ways to live with what exceeds them. Myth is one of those ways, not as illusion but as adaptation. The remaining question is not whether this process will continue, but how consciously it will be recognized, and what it might offer if approached not with urgency or fear, but with calm curiosity and reflection. That calm curiosity is perhaps the most mature expression of humanity's relationship with the sky. It represents a balance between knowing and not knowing, between explanation and acceptance. Instead of rushing to fill every gap with certainty, there is space to observe how meaning forms and why it feels necessary in the first place. Across long stretches of history, this balance has shifted repeatedly. Periods of intense myth-making have been followed by periods of rational consolidation. Neither state lasts forever. Each responds to the conditions of its time. When uncertainty increases, stories expand. When stability returns, stories soften. The cycle is not a failure to progress, but a way of regulating collective experience. In this sense, myth is not opposed to knowledge. It emerges alongside it, responding to questions knowledge cannot fully resolve. Science can explain motion, origin, and probability. It cannot fully address how it feels to exist within a universe that vastly exceeds human scale. That emotional dimension remains regardless of how much is known. Events like Three Eye Atlas bring this distinction into focus. They remind people that even with advanced tools and language, the encounter with the unfamiliar still carries weight. The response may be quieter, more measured, but it is no less human. Attention still lifts, perspective still widens, meaning still begins to form. What is different now is the opportunity for reflection during the process itself. People can notice their reactions, question their assumptions, and observe how narratives develop. This does not eliminate myth-making. It refines it. Stories become less rigid, more provisional, more aware of their own construction. This awareness opens the possibility for a gentler relationship with uncertainty, one that does not demand immediate resolution or dramatic framing, one that allows curiosity to exist without fear and meaning to form without urgency. In this space, myth becomes less about explanation and more about orientation. As this chapter of the Three Eye Atlas series draws toward its close, the focus settles on this orientation. Not what the sky is telling us, but how we listen. Not what stories we tell, but why we feel compelled to tell them at all. The sky will continue to offer moments of interruption. Objects will pass. Lights will change. Patterns will break. Each time, humans will respond in familiar ways, shaped by ancient habits and modern awareness alike. What matters is not stopping this response, but understanding it, seeing it as part of a long inheritance of attention, memory, and meaning. An inheritance that has allowed humans, across countless generations, to live beneath the same sky with curiosity rather than silence. And in that understanding, there is a quiet continuity, a sense that while the universe remains vast and indifferent, the human capacity to reflect, to share, and to gently turn experience into story endures, steady as the sky itself. That sense of continuity carries us naturally into a deeper layer of reflection, where the focus shifts from patterns of response to the consequences of those patterns over long spans of time. When stories repeat across generations, they do more than explain moments. They shape worldview. They influence how societies understand change, catastrophe, and renewal. In ancient mythic frameworks, celestial disruption was often linked to cycles of destruction and rebirth. The sky did not merely interrupt daily life. It marked transitions between eras. Floods, fires, and resets were written into cosmology as necessary corrections rather than random disasters. These narratives offered reassurance that disruption was part of a larger order, not an end without meaning. This framing served an important psychological function. It allowed communities to survive loss without collapsing into despair. By embedding catastrophe within a cycle, myth transformed trauma into continuity. What was destroyed would eventually be renewed. What was lost would return in another form. The sky, as the most stable reference point, became the keeper of this long memory. While modern discourse rarely speaks in terms of cosmic resets, the emotional logic remains familiar. When unexpected events occur, people instinctively search for larger patterns. Is this part of a trend, a shift, a signal of something changing? These questions echo ancient concerns, even when framed through statistics and forecasts. With Three Eye Atlas, some of the attention it attracted stemmed from this deeper layer of pattern recognition, not fear of the object itself, but curiosity about what it represented within a broader sequence. Was it rare? Was it unprecedented? Did it fit into something larger? These questions reveal an inherited sensitivity to disruption as potential transition. This sensitivity is not irrational. Over evolutionary time, change often did signal danger or opportunity. The mind learned to treat anomalies as meaningful. Myth preserved this instinct by giving it narrative form, allowing it to be shared and refined rather than acted upon blindly. As civilizations developed, these narratives became more abstract. Gods gave way to forces. Forces gave way to laws. Yet the underlying concern with cycles persisted. History itself began to be understood as rhythmic rather than linear. Rise and fall, expansion and collapse, stability and disruption. Celestial imagery remained central to this understanding because the sky offered visible cycles on scales beyond human control. Day and night, seasons, long-term celestial movements. These rhythms suggested that change, even when destructive, was not arbitrary. In this light, mythic catastrophes were not predictions, but interpretations. They were ways of integrating loss into continuity. Modern societies may resist such framing, preferring to isolate events, yet the emotional impulse to connect disruption to larger patterns remains active. As this exploration moves deeper into its later stages, the emphasis turns toward this ancient relationship between catastrophe and meaning, how humans have used the sky to contextualize endings, and how that habit still quietly influences how modern events, including those like Three-Eye Atlas, are perceived within the long arc of time. That long arc of time becomes easier to sense when disruption is framed as part of continuity rather than interruption alone. Ancient societies understood this intuitively. They lived closer to environmental cycles and were more directly exposed to forces they could not control. In such conditions, the idea that destruction and renewal were linked was not philosophical speculation. It was lived experience. Celestial myths absorbed this experience and projected it outward. The sky became a stage where cycles were made visible. When something unusual appeared above, it was often interpreted as a signal that a larger transition was underway, not because the object caused the change, but because it coincided with a moment of heightened awareness. The sky marked the time, even if it did not initiate the event. This distinction is important. Myth did not require celestial events to be agents of catastrophe. They were witnesses, markers, points of reference that helped societies situate their own upheavals within a larger story. In doing so, the sky offered perspective. It suggested that human turmoil unfolded within a broader, enduring order. Modern interpretations tend to resist this framing, favoring separation between natural phenomena and human affairs. Yet the impulse to connect them remains. When unexpected events occur in the world, people still look for signs, correlations, and narratives that link them together. The language has changed, but the instinct has not. With Three-Eye Atlas, this instinct appeared in subtle ways. Questions about rarity and timing carried an undercurrent of pattern seeking. Was this part of something larger? Had similar events happened before? What did their appearance coincide with? These questions were rarely voiced as belief, but they shaped attention nonetheless. This reveals how deeply embedded the search for cycles remains. Humans are not comfortable with randomness alone. They seek rhythm, recurrence, and structure. Myth historically provided those structures when empirical explanation was unavailable. Today, data often provides the structure, but narrative still supplies coherence. Over long periods, this blending of structure and story influences how societies remember their past. Events become grouped into eras. Transitions acquire symbolic markers. The sky, visible across generations, offers continuity against which change can be measured. A comet remembered generations later may signify not its physical passage, but the time in which it appeared. In this way, celestial myths function as temporal anchors. They tie memory to visible phenomena, making abstract time more tangible. The past becomes something that can be pointed to, described, and shared. This anchoring helps societies maintain identity across disruption. As this series continues to unfold, the emphasis remains on this quiet functionality. Myth is not about predicting catastrophe or assigning blame. It is about preserving continuity when circumstances change. It allows humans to remember themselves across breaks in stability. Understanding this function reframes modern reactions as well. Attention around Three-Eye Atlas atlas can be seen not as overreaction, but as a familiar attempt to place the present within a longer timeline, to understand where we are by noticing what appears above us. The sky does not provide answers, but it offers reference. And for a species deeply concerned with continuity, reference has always been enough to begin the work of meaning. That need for reference becomes especially strong during moments when ordinary markers of time feel unstable. Wars, migrations, technological shifts, and cultural transitions all disrupt familiar rhythms. In such periods, humans instinctively search for something that appears unchanged, something that can anchor experience beyond immediate circumstances. The sky has always fulfilled that role. Ancient cultures looked upward not only to mark seasons, but to steady themselves psychologically. The stars returned night after night. The sun followed its path. Even when life on the ground felt uncertain, the heavens suggested continuity. Against this backdrop, anomalies stood out sharply. When the familiar order of the sky itself appeared to shift, it carried symbolic weight far beyond its physical reality. This is why celestial events were often remembered as turning points, not because they caused historical change, but because they coincided with it. Memory naturally links events that occur close together in time, especially when both are emotionally charged. Myth emerged from this linkage, weaving human experience and celestial observation into a single narrative thread. Modern societies experience instability differently, but the psychological need for anchors remains. Rapid change can make time feel compressed and disorienting. In such conditions, attention gravitates toward events that seem to exist outside daily flux. When something like 3i Atlas enters awareness, it briefly feels detached from human systems, untouched by politics, economics, or personal routine. This detachment gives it symbolic clarity. For a moment, the object appears neutral, almost timeless. It becomes a reference point against which everything else can be measured. Even discussions framed in technical language often carry this subtext. The sky is invoked not to explain society, but to momentarily step outside it. This stepping outside is an important psychological release. It allows perspective to widen without requiring immediate action. Myth historically served this function by situating present concerns within cosmic scale. Modern narratives, though less overtly symbolic, still create similar breathing room. Over time, these moments accumulate. Each one reinforces the idea that human experience unfolds within a larger frame. This awareness can be unsettling, but it can also be stabilizing. It reminds people that change, even dramatic change, is part of a much longer story. As attention gradually moves away from specific events, what remains is this expanded sense of time. The sky fades back into background, but its role as reference persists. It continues to offer scale whenever it is needed. Approaching the later stages of this exploration, the focus begins to settle on the emotional outcomes of this long relationship. How myth, memory, and observation have helped humans endure uncertainty without losing coherence, and how that ancient strategy still quietly shapes modern responses when something unfamiliar appears above, asking to be noticed once again. That endurance, sustained quietly over centuries, is one of the most consistent outcomes of humanity's engagement with the sky. While technologies, beliefs, and languages have changed, the emotional need to remain coherent in the face of uncertainty has not. Myth has repeatedly served as a stabilizing thread, weaving together moments that might otherwise feel disconnected or overwhelming. In ancient societies, this stabilization was visible in how celestial stories were preserved even as cultures transformed. Empires rose and fell, cities were abandoned, names were forgotten, yet certain sky stories endured. They were retold because they carried something essential, not information, but orientation. They reminded listeners how to stand in relation to forces larger than themselves. This orientation did not eliminate fear, but it softened it. By placing the unknown within a familiar structure, myth reduced isolation. Individuals were no longer alone with their uncertainty. They shared it with ancestors, with community, with future generations who would inherit the same stories and, with them, the same emotional tools. Modern societies often underestimate the importance of these tools. There is an assumption that explanation alone is sufficient, yet explanation does not always translate into reassurance. Knowing how something works does not automatically tell us how to live with it. Myth filled that gap by addressing the human side of knowledge, the part that needs meaning more than certainty. With events like 3I Atlas, this gap becomes visible again. Even when explanations are clear and accessible, attention still gathers around narrative. People discuss not only what the object is, but how it fits into a broader sense of time and place. This is not confusion, it is continuity. What has changed is subtlety. Modern myths are rarely declared as such. They are embedded in tone, emphasis, and framing rather than explicit symbolism. They exist in the background of conversation, shaping perception without demanding belief. This makes them harder to notice, but no less influential. As these narratives circulate, they quietly reinforce a shared sense of scale. They remind people that life unfolds within contexts far larger than immediate concerns. This reminder can feel humbling, but it can also be grounding. It places personal experience within a wider continuity that extends beyond any single moment. Over long periods, this grounding effect accumulates. Societies that can contextualize disruption are better able to adapt to it. Myth has historically contributed to this resilience by providing continuity when certainty was unavailable. It offered a way to move forward without needing complete understanding. As this exploration continues, the emphasis now turns toward release. Not abandonment of meaning, but a gentle loosening of urgency. Having traced how humans respond, remember, and stabilize themselves through stories of the sky, what remains is to consider how these patterns might be held with greater awareness. The sky will continue to change, and humans will continue to notice. What can change is the relationship to that noticing. Less fear, less urgency, more reflection. In that shift, the ancient function of myth remains, not as doctrine or warning, but as a quiet companion helping humanity remain oriented beneath an ever-expanding sky. That quieter companionship marks a transition in how myth functions as societies mature. Instead of standing at the center of belief, it moves to the periphery of awareness, guiding rather than commanding. The stories no longer insist on interpretation. They offer context, waiting patiently to be noticed when uncertainty returns. This shift does not weaken myth, it refines it. When narratives are held lightly, they gain flexibility. They can adapt without breaking. They can coexist with explanation rather than competing against it. In this form, myth becomes less about answers and more about orientation, less about certainty and more about balance. Ancient cultures often held myth and observation together without tension. The sky could be both a physical reality and a symbolic one. Modern thinking tends to separate these domains, yet moments like 3I Atlas reveal how easily they rejoin. The mind moves fluidly between data and meaning, often without recognizing the transition. This fluidity suggests that myth is not a stage humanity outgrows. It is a mode that activates when conditions call for it. When experience exceeds familiar scale, narrative returns as a stabilizing presence. It does not override knowledge. It complements it, addressing the emotional dimensions that knowledge alone leaves untouched. Over generations, this complementarity has allowed humans to remain curious without becoming overwhelmed. The sky has always been a testing ground for this balance. Too much fear leads to paralysis. Too much detachment leads to indifference. Myth occupies the space between, preserving engagement while softening impact. In the modern era, that space is often narrow. Information moves quickly. Interpretation accelerates. There is pressure to decide what something means almost immediately. Yet the deeper patterns traced throughout this series suggest another option. Meaning does not have to be immediate to be meaningful. It can unfold slowly, revisited over time. When attention around Three-Eye Atlas eventually fades, what remains is not a conclusion, but a trace, a reminder of how quickly humans orient themselves around the unfamiliar and how naturally stories arise to support that orientation. These traces accumulate quietly, shaping intuition more than belief. As this exploration approaches its final phase, the emphasis rests on this accumulation, not dramatic myths carved in stone, but subtle patterns etched into perception, ways of noticing, ways of responding, ways of remembering. In this sense, the sky continues to teach, not through instruction, but through repetition. It offers moments of interruption, then returns to silence. Humans respond, then settle. Over and over, across centuries, the same exchange unfolds. What remains to be considered is how this exchange might be carried forward with intention, not to control it, but to recognize it, to see myth not as something that happens to us, but as something we participate in, gently shaping how the vastness above becomes livable below. That gentle participation is often unnoticed because it feels automatic. Humans rarely decide to make meaning. Meaning forms as a response, shaped by attention, memory, and context. When something unfamiliar appears in the sky, the mind does not pause to choose narrative. It begins assembling one almost immediately, drawing from a long inheritance of prior responses. This inheritance is not stored as specific stories alone, but as tendencies, a readiness to interpret, a sensitivity to anomaly, a habit of linking the present moment to something larger than itself. These tendencies operate quietly, guiding perception before conscious reasoning has time to intervene. In ancient societies, this process was reinforced through ritual and repetition. Children learned how to look at the sky long before they learned why it mattered. Stories did not simply explain celestial events. They trained attention. They taught what was worth noticing and how to feel when it was noticed. Modern life offers fewer shared rituals tied to the sky, yet the training persists in subtler forms. Education, media, and cultural memory all contribute to a background understanding that the sky is significant, even if rarely considered. When something breaks the usual pattern, that latent significance activates. With Three-Eye Atlas, this activation was brief but revealing. The object itself did not demand interpretation, yet interpretation arrived nonetheless. People discussed, speculated, contextualized. The process unfolded smoothly, almost effortlessly, as if following a well-worn path. This ease suggests that myth-making is not a disruption of rational thought, but an extension of it. It organizes experience at a scale where direct comprehension falters. Where detail becomes overwhelming, narrative restores coherence. It does not simplify reality so much as make it usable. Over time, repeated use of this process shapes identity. Cultures come to see themselves as part of longer arcs, larger cycles, broader continuities. The sky, always present yet always beyond reach, reinforces this perspective. It reminds humans that they exist within patterns they did not create and cannot fully control. This reminder can be unsettling, but it can also be comforting. It places individual life within a shared story that extends far beyond personal concern. Myth has historically carried this comfort, offering a sense of belonging within immensity. As this series moves steadily toward its conclusion, the focus narrows once more, from broad patterns back to individual experience. How it feels, in quiet moments, to realize that the impulse to tell stories about the sky is not something learned recently, but something deeply inherited. In recognizing this inheritance, there is no need to reject it or surrender to it. Awareness alone is enough. Awareness allows space between event and interpretation, between stimulus and story. In that space, curiosity can replace urgency, and reflection can replace fear. The sky will continue to offer moments that draw the eye upward. When it does, the ancient process will begin again. Observation, interpretation, memory. The difference lies in whether we notice the pattern as it unfolds and whether we allow it to guide us gently rather than carry us away. That noticing, subtle and unforced, opens the possibility of a different relationship with uncertainty. Instead of reacting immediately, the mind can linger briefly in observation. It can feel the familiar pull towards story without rushing to complete it. This pause does not stop meaning from forming. It simply allows meaning to breathe. In ancient contexts, such pauses were rare. Survival demanded quick interpretation. The unknown had to be named, placed, and integrated as swiftly as possible. Myth emerged under pressure, shaped by necessity. Today, many of those pressures have eased, but the reflex remains. The challenge is not to suppress it, but to soften it. When attention turned toward Three-Eye Atlas, there was a brief opportunity to witness this reflex in real time. The object appeared, information circulated, and narratives began to take shape almost immediately. Yet alongside this, there was also a quieter response, a recognition that the story itself was part of a much older pattern. This dual awareness marks a subtle evolution. Humans can now experience myth-making while simultaneously observing it. The story unfolds, but so does reflection on why it unfolds. This does not diminish the story's value. It adds depth, allowing engagement without surrender. Such awareness can change how stories settle into memory. Instead of hardening into fixed interpretations, they remain fluid. They can be revisited, revised, or gently released when their moment passes. Myth becomes less about permanence and more about process. This shift mirrors broader changes in how time itself is experienced. Ancient myths often sought to fix meaning across generations. Modern narratives accept transience more readily. They acknowledge that meaning can be temporary and still worthwhile. An event can matter deeply for a moment and then fade without loss. The sky accommodates both perspectives. It offers constancy and change at the same time. Stars appear fixed, yet they move. Patterns repeat, yet never exactly the same way. Myth arose from this tension, translating it into human terms. That translation continues, even as awareness grows. As this exploration nears its final arc, the emphasis rests on this capacity for gentle engagement, to look up without urgency, to notice the impulse to explain without forcing closure, to allow the story to form and dissolve naturally. In doing so, humans honor both their ancient inheritance and their present understanding. They remain connected to those who once watched the same sky with fewer tools but similar emotions. They also remain open to new ways of holding meaning, shaped by reflection rather than fear. The sky does not demand stories. It simply offers itself, vast and indifferent. Humans respond because responding is how they orient themselves within immensity. Whether through myth, model, or quiet contemplation, the response continues. What remains is not an answer, but a practice, a way of meeting the unknown with steadiness, of recognizing that the urge to turn celestial events into stories is not a flaw to overcome, but a human rhythm to be understood, respected, and gently carried forward into whatever comes next. That rhythm, carried forward almost effortlessly, reaches its most reflective state when humans begin to sense its age. When a response feels familiar, not because it has happened before in one lifetime, but because it has happened many times across many lives. In those moments, looking up becomes an act of continuity rather than reaction. Ancient observers did not have this historical perspective. They lived inside the rhythm without naming it. For them, myth was not a category or a process. It was simply how reality was held together, meaning memory and observation existed as a single movement, inseparable and unquestioned. Modern awareness introduces distance. The rhythm can now be recognized as rhythm. The story can be seen as story. This does not empty it of meaning. It allows meaning to be approached with care rather than urgency. When something unfamiliar appears in the sky, the mind can acknowledge both the impulse to narrate and the option to pause. This pause is not detachment. It is attentiveness without demand. It allows the experience to register fully before being shaped. In this space, the sky can be encountered as it is, without immediately becoming symbol or signal. The vastness remains vast. The uncertainty remains open. Events like Three-Eye Atlas briefly create this space. They interrupt routine just enough to invite reflection, not only about the object itself, but about the long history of similar interruptions. Each one has passed, each one has left traces. Together, they form a quiet lineage of moments when humanity looked up and recalibrated its sense of place. This lineage does not require preservation through grand myths or lasting narratives. Its continuity is felt rather than recorded. It exists in the ease with which attention shifts upward, in the familiarity of curiosity, in the calm that follows once the moment settles. Over time, this calm becomes its own form of wisdom, a recognition that the unknown does not always need to be resolved. That vastness can be acknowledged without being conquered by explanation. That meaning can arise and fade without being fixed in belief. In ancient times, myth carried this wisdom implicitly. It reassured by framing the unknown within story. Today, awareness carries it explicitly. It reassures by revealing the pattern itself. The effect is similar. Orientation returns. Balance is restored. As the narrative moves toward its closing chapters, this understanding becomes central. The story of Three-Eye Atlas is not ultimately about an object in space. It is about how easily humans recognize themselves in moments of cosmic attention. The sky continues its movements, indifferent and immense. Humans continue to watch, interpret, and remember. Between these two motions lies a quiet agreement that has endured for millennia. The sky offers interruption, humanity offers meaning, and in that exchange, both remain unchanged, yet endlessly renewed. That quiet agreement between interruption and meaning carries us into a more interpretive phase, where reflection turns toward theory rather than memory. Once the rhythm is recognized, questions naturally arise about how ancient stories should be understood today. Were myths literal attempts to explain events, or symbolic frameworks designed to carry experience across time? The answer, as with most human creations, is rarely singular. Ancient myths were not written with modern categories in mind. The distinction between literal and symbolic did not exist in the same way. A story could be both at once, grounding emotion in image while preserving memory through metaphor. To ask whether a myth was factual is often to ask the wrong question. Its purpose was not to record data, but to transmit significance. This becomes especially clear in myths involving the sky. Celestial language is inherently symbolic because the scale it describes exceeds direct experience. Fire, serpents, wheels, and eyes appear repeatedly, not because observers misunderstood what they saw, but because these forms were the closest available expressions of motion, light, and presence beyond human scale. Modern interpretation often oscillates between two extremes. One dismisses myths as primitive errors. The other reads them as coded science. Both approaches miss the deeper function. Myths were emotional technologies. They translated overwhelming experience into forms that could be shared, remembered, and revisited without re-traumatization. When contemporary audiences revisit these stories in light of modern events like Three-Eye Atlas, the temptation to reinterpret them literally resurfaces. Similarities are drawn, patterns are compared. While this impulse is understandable, it often reveals more about present concerns than ancient intent. Each generation rereads myth through its own lens. This rereading is not distortion, it is continuity. Myths survive precisely because they can be reinterpreted. They adapt to new knowledge, new fears, and new questions. What remains stable is not the imagery, but the emotional core, awe, vulnerability, curiosity, and the desire for orientation persist even as explanations change. Understanding this allows for a more nuanced engagement with ancient narratives. Instead of asking whether they predict modern phenomena, we can ask what human experience they were preserving. What did it feel like to witness disruption in the sky without explanatory frameworks? How did people carry that feeling forward? In this light, myth becomes less about the past and more about inheritance. It is a record of how humans have repeatedly met the unknown and found ways to live with it. Events like Three-Eye Atlas do not confirm or deny ancient stories. They activate the same psychological terrain that gave rise to them. As this interpretive phase continues, the focus will remain on this terrain, on how symbolic language emerges, why it persists, and how it continues to shape perception, even in an age of measurement. The sky may be mapped in detail, but the human response to it still moves along ancient paths, quietly translating vastness into meaning. That translation of vastness into symbol is where interpretation becomes most delicate. Symbols are not fixed codes. They are living containers, shaped by culture, environment, and emotional need. When ancient people described the sky in images of descent, conflict, or transformation, they were not documenting mechanics. They were expressing relationship. Modern attempts to decode these symbols often assume a one-to-one correspondence between image and event. Yet, symbolic language rarely works this way. A single image can hold many layers at once. Fire may represent light, danger, purification, or presence. A wheel may represent motion, time, or continuity. These meanings shift depending on context, but the emotional resonance remains stable. This stability is what allows myths to survive across centuries. The symbol endures even as interpretation changes. It remains useful because it does not demand precision. It invites reflection. In doing so, it keeps the emotional memory of the sky accessible long after the original event has passed. When modern audiences encounter events like Three-Eye Atlas, the same symbolic impulse can surface unconsciously. Language begins to stretch, metaphors appear. The object is described not only in terms of data, but in terms of what it feels like to notice it. Even restrained commentary often carries traces of this symbolic reach. This does not signal a failure of rational thought. It reveals its limits. Rational explanation describes what something is. Symbolic language describes how it is experienced. Both are necessary for full comprehension, especially when scale and uncertainty are involved. Throughout history, tension between these modes has periodically resurfaced. Periods of symbolic dominance give way to periods of analytical emphasis, and then back again. Neither replaces the other permanently. They alternate, each correcting the excesses of the other. In the present moment, awareness of this alternation is increasing. People recognize the value of metaphor without mistaking it for fact. They can engage with symbolic narratives while remaining grounded in empirical understanding. This balanced engagement is one of the defining features of modern interpretation. Seen from this perspective, ancient myths do not compete with modern explanations. They complement them by offering insight into the human side of observation. They show how meaning was carried when measurement was unavailable and how emotion was integrated into understanding. As this phase of the series continues, the emphasis shifts towards synthesis, not choosing between symbolic and literal readings, but understanding how and why they coexist. Events like Three-Eye Atlas provide contemporary examples of this coexistence, revealing that the old patterns have not vanished. They have simply become more nuanced. The sky remains the same vast canvas it has always been. Humans remain meaning makers beneath it. Between these two constants lies a long tradition of interpretation, one that continues to evolve while preserving its essential purpose, to help humans live with what exceeds them without losing themselves in the process. That synthesis between symbolic and literal understanding becomes clearer when we examine how modern frameworks quietly inherit ancient structures. Even the most technical explanations rely on metaphor to communicate scale. We speak of cosmic neighborhoods, stellar nurseries, and galactic rivers. These phrases are not scientific errors. They are bridges, helping the human mind approach what cannot be directly experienced. This bridging function is ancient. Myth once served as the primary bridge between observation and comprehension. Today, science builds its own bridges, but the underlying need remains unchanged. When confronted with immensity, the mind still seeks familiar shapes to hold unfamiliar concepts. Events like 3I Atlas highlight this continuity. Despite precise measurements and cautious language, discussion often gravitates toward origin stories. Where did it come from? What path did it take? What does its appearance signify? These are narrative questions. They organize information into sequences that feel meaningful rather than isolated. The persistence of narrative structure reveals something important. Humans do not experience reality as a collection of disconnected facts. They experience it as unfolding. Stories mirror this unfolding, aligning external events with internal perception. Myth was one of the earliest tools for achieving this alignment. Over time, as knowledge expanded, myth did not vanish. It receded into the background, shaping assumptions rather than declarations. Concepts like progress, cycles, and transformation carry mythic residue even when expressed in secular terms. The sky has always been central to these concepts because it offers visible continuity across generations. This continuity fosters a sense of participation in something larger than oneself. Ancient myths made this participation explicit. Modern narratives imply it more subtly, yet the emotional effect is similar. Individuals feel connected to a longer timeline, a broader context that extends beyond immediate experience. Such connection can be grounding. It reduces isolation by situating personal life within a shared human story. When something unfamiliar appears in the sky, it briefly renews this connection. Attention lifts, perspective widens, the present moment opens into a larger frame. As this exploration continues, the emphasis rests on recognizing these moments not as anomalies, but as expressions of an enduring human strategy. Myth, symbol, and story are not relics. They are tools, continually reshaped to meet the needs of each era. The challenge is not to eliminate these tools, but to use them consciously, to allow story to orient without misleading, to allow symbol to resonate without being mistaken for fact. This balanced use preserves both emotional depth and intellectual clarity. In the later stages of this series, the focus will turn toward what this balance offers, how awareness of inherited patterns can soften reaction, deepen reflection, and foster a calmer engagement with the unknown. The sky will continue to offer moments of interruption. What changes is how those moments are held. Between the vastness above and the stories below lies a quiet space of interpretation. In that space, humans have always found a way to belong, carrying forward meaning without claiming mastery, and living beneath the sky with curiosity rather than fear. That quiet space of interpretation becomes most valuable when it is approached with humility. Humility not as submission, but as recognition of scale. The sky reminds humans that understanding is always partial, provisional, and unfolding. Myth arose not to conquer that limitation, but to live comfortably within it. Ancient storytellers did not seek final answers. They sought continuity. Their narratives allowed questions to remain open while still providing structure for experience. In this way, myth respected the unknown rather than attempting to erase it. It acknowledged that some aspects of reality would always exceed explanation. Modern thought often struggles with this restraint. There is a tendency to pursue closure, to resolve ambiguity as quickly as possible. Yet moments like the attention surrounding 3I Atlas reveal how natural it still feels to linger in uncertainty. Curiosity persists even when conclusions are available. The mind wants to sit with the event, not just categorize it. This desire to linger is deeply human. It reflects an intuitive understanding that meaning is not always found in answers, but in engagement. Myths historically created this engagement by inviting reflection rather than resolution. They offered narratives that could be revisited, retold, and reinterpreted without being exhausted. In modern contexts, engagement often takes quieter forms. Thoughtful discussion, restrained speculation, and reflective pause all serve similar functions. They keep attention open without forcing belief. They allow the sky to remain a source of wonder rather than a problem to be solved. As societies become more aware of their own interpretive habits, this kind of engagement becomes easier to sustain. People can recognize when narrative is forming and choose how deeply to enter it. This choice does not diminish meaning. It refines it, making space for both knowledge and mystery. Over long periods, such refinement shapes culture. It encourages resilience rather than reaction, curiosity rather than fear. Myth, in its evolved form, supports this resilience by offering a way to carry uncertainty without urgency. The sky continues to provide opportunities for this practice. Each unfamiliar object, each unexpected movement invites attention. The invitation does not demand a story, but it allows one. Whether the story is brief or enduring depends on how it is held. As this narrative moves toward its closing reflections, the emphasis remains on this holding, not grasping for certainty, not resisting interpretation, simply allowing experience to register fully, supported by an awareness of the long human tradition that has always done the same. In this awareness, the relationship between humans and the sky feels less reactive and more reflective, less about explanation and more about presence. And in that presence, the ancient impulse to turn celestial events into meaning finds its calmest expression, not as myth imposed, but as understanding gently unfolding. That gentle unfolding of understanding prepares the ground for the final phase of reflection, where attention turns inward rather than upward. After observing how stories form, adapt, and settle, what becomes visible is not the sky itself, but the human need to feel oriented within it. The sky has always been the catalyst. The deeper subject has always been the observer. Across time, humans have lived with a paradox. They are small in scale, yet capable of imagining vastness. They are bound to brief lifespans, yet drawn to cycles that extend far beyond them. This tension produces discomfort, but it also produces meaning. Myth emerges from this tension as a way to reconcile the two. Ancient narratives made this reconciliation explicit. Gods bridged heaven and earth. Stories linked human action to cosmic order. Modern narratives rarely personify the sky in this way, yet the impulse to connect personal existence to a larger frame persists. It appears in questions of legacy, continuity, and place. Events like Three-Eye Atlas quietly reactivate these questions. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. They remind individuals that they are participants in a much longer story than their own lives. This reminder can feel humbling, but it can also be grounding. It reduces the weight of immediacy by placing it within a broader context. This is one of the most enduring functions of myth. It reduces existential isolation. By situating individual experience within a shared narrative, it offers belonging within immensity. The sky, visible to all and owned by none, becomes the ultimate shared reference. In modern society, where individual experience is often emphasized, this shared reference is easy to overlook. Yet moments of collective attention reveal how deeply it still matters. When many people look up, even indirectly, a sense of quiet connection forms. The unknown becomes something held together rather than alone. As this exploration nears its conclusion, the emphasis rests on this holding. Myth is not something that happens to humanity. It is something humanity does, often without noticing. It is a way of holding experience when scale threatens to overwhelm. Recognizing this does not demand a return to ancient belief. It invites a softer awareness of how meaning forms and why it feels necessary. It allows individuals to engage with the sky without urgency, curiosity without fear, and story without surrender. The final movement of this narrative will not seek to resolve the questions raised along the way. Instead, it will allow them to remain open, as they have always been. The sky continues. Humanity continues. Between them, the quiet practice of meaning-making endures, steady and patient, waiting for the next moment when attention lifts and the ancient rhythm begins once again. That ancient rhythm, returning again and again, does not ask to be completed. It asks only to be recognized. When humans understand that their responses to the sky are part of a long continuum, something subtle shifts. The urgency softens. The need to extract final meaning relaxes. What remains is presence rather than conclusion. In this presence, the sky is no longer a puzzle demanding solution, nor a stage demanding drama. It becomes what it has always been, a vast reference against which human thought measures itself, a reminder that existence extends beyond immediate concern, beyond personal narrative, beyond any single generation. Ancient myths carried this reminder through story. Modern reflection carries it through awareness. Both arrive at a similar outcome, a quiet acceptance that not everything must be resolved to be meaningful. That uncertainty can be lived with, not only endured. Events like 3i Atlas briefly sharpen this awareness. They interrupt routine just enough to expose the deeper pattern. Attention lifts, interpretation stirs, and then, if allowed, understanding settles into something calmer than explanation, a recognition of continuity rather than exception. This recognition does not diminish curiosity, it refines it. Curiosity becomes less about prediction and more about relationship. Less about what will happen, and more about how humans respond when something unfamiliar appears. The sky becomes a mirror again, reflecting not danger or destiny, but perception itself. Over long periods, this reflective stance has quietly shaped philosophy, art, and science alike. Each discipline, in its own way, has attempted to articulate humanity's place within immensity. Myth was one of the earliest expressions of this effort, but it was never the last. It remains woven into every attempt to think beyond the immediate. As this narrative approaches its final closing blocks, the emphasis rests on this enduring effort, not to master the unknown, but to remain oriented within it, to recognize that the impulse to turn celestial events into stories is not something to be outgrown, but something to be understood. The sky will continue to change in ways that attract attention. Objects will appear, patterns will shift. Each time, humans will feel the familiar pull toward meaning. What changes, slowly and gently, is how that pull is held. In awareness, it becomes lighter. In reflection, it becomes deeper. And in continuity, it becomes something quietly sustaining rather than demanding. The ancient rhythm persists, not as myth alone, but as a human response to scale itself, steady and unbroken beneath the vast, indifferent sky. That steadiness beneath vastness carries us into the final reflections, where the question is no longer how myths form, but why they continue to matter even when their origins are understood. Once the mechanism is visible, once the pattern is recognized, the impulse does not disappear. It simply changes tone. It becomes quieter, more reflective, less urgent. Humans do not stop telling stories when they understand why stories exist. They tell them differently, with more awareness, with more restraint, with a deeper sense of responsibility toward meaning itself. In this way, recognizing myth as a human response does not weaken it. It refines it. The sky has always offered a kind of emotional calibration. By reminding humans of scale, it resets perspective. Personal concerns shrink. Time stretches. The present moment opens into something larger. Myths historically preserved this calibration, ensuring it could be accessed even when the sky itself was hidden by cloud, night, or memory. Modern life often moves too quickly for such recalibration to occur naturally. Attention is fragmented. Perspective narrows, yet moments like the public focus on 3i Atlas briefly restore that widening. They interrupt momentum, offering a pause in which scale becomes visible again. What matters is not how dramatic the interruption is, but that it occurs at all. Even a small shift in attention can reconnect individuals to a longer continuity. The sky does not need to announce itself loudly. It only needs to be noticed. In ancient times, myth ensured this noticing would not be lost. It carried awareness forward through language, ritual, and story. Today, awareness can be carried internally through reflection rather than retelling. The function remains the same: orientation within immensity. As this series approaches its final closing blocks, the focus rests on inheritance, not of specific stories, but of capacity. The capacity to pause, to reflect, to sense scale without fear, to allow meaning to arise without forcing it into certainty. This capacity has been shaped over thousands of years of looking up. It lives quietly within modern minds, ready to activate whenever the familiar order is briefly interrupted. The appearance of something unfamiliar in the sky does not create this response. It reveals it. In that revelation, there is no demand for belief, no call to alarm. Only an invitation to notice how deeply human perception is shaped by its long relationship with what lies above. The sky remains vast. Humans remain meaning makers, and between them, a quiet understanding continues to form, steady enough to be carried forward into whatever moments of attention await beyond the present. That quiet understanding carries a final insight as this exploration reaches its last reflective turn. The stories humans tell about the sky are not attempts to explain the universe away. They are attempts to remain present within it. When meaning is allowed to emerge slowly, without urgency or fear, it becomes something that supports rather than overwhelms. Ancient myths often carried this support implicitly. They offered a sense of place within an order that felt larger and more enduring than individual life. Modern awareness makes this function explicit. People can now recognize the role story plays in shaping perception and still choose to engage with it gently without surrendering to it. This choice marks a subtle but important shift. It suggests that myth does not belong only to the past, nor does it need to dominate the present. It can exist as a background rhythm, steady and reassuring, reminding humans of continuity without demanding belief or obedience. When events like Three-Eye Atlas capture attention, they briefly activate this rhythm. The response is no longer about fear or prediction, but about recognition. Recognition that humans have always paused at such moments. Recognition that the impulse to look up and wonder is older than any single explanation. This recognition can be calming. It reframes uncertainty as familiar rather than threatening. The unknown becomes something humanity has lived with for as long as it has existed. Myths were one way of carrying that relationship forward. Reflection is another. As the sky returns to background and attention settles back into daily life, the experience does not vanish. It integrates. It becomes part of an internal landscape shaped by countless similar moments across history. Each one leaves a trace, subtle but cumulative. In this sense, myth is less about what is remembered and more about how remembering happens. It shapes the way experiences are held, revisited, and released. It teaches that not everything must be resolved to be meaningful, and not every question must be answered to be lived with. Approaching the final closing movement of this narrative, the emphasis rests on this lesson. The sky will continue to offer moments of interruption. Humans will continue to respond. What endures is the capacity to meet those moments with steadiness rather than urgency. In that steadiness, the ancient habit of turning celestial events into stories finds its most balanced expression, not as belief imposed from the past, but as awareness carried into the present. A quiet inheritance that allows humans to live beneath an immense universe with curiosity, humility, and calm. That calm carried forward is the true inheritance left by countless generations who learned to live beneath the sky. Long before explanations were formalized, before measurements replaced memory, humans discovered that attention itself could be stabilizing. To look up was not only to observe, but to remember that existence extended beyond the immediate and the personal. This awareness shaped responsibility as much as curiosity. When people believed their lives unfolded within larger cycles, actions felt connected to something enduring. The sky became a reminder that individual moments mattered because they were part of continuity. Myth preserved this sense of participation, linking present behavior to past memory and future consequence. In modern life, this connection can feel distant. Daily concerns often dominate attention, narrowing perspective. Yet moments of celestial interruption quietly restore what routine obscures. When an object like 3i Atlas enters awareness, it does not demand action. It invites orientation. It asks, without words, where one stands within time. This invitation is rarely dramatic. It unfolds slowly, often unnoticed. A pause in thought, a brief sense of scale, a recognition that human life, however complex, unfolds within a much older and wider context. These moments do not change the world, but they change how the world is felt. Over generations, such moments accumulate into wisdom, not written instruction, but lived familiarity with uncertainty, a knowledge that not everything can be controlled, yet not everything is threatening. The sky teaches this lesson repeatedly, through both its constancy and its surprises. Myth once carried this wisdom forward through story. Today, it can be carried through reflection alone. The form changes, but the function remains, to remind humans that meaning does not require mastery, and that understanding can coexist with humility. As this narrative enters its final reflections, the emphasis rests on responsibility rather than explanation. Responsibility to notice, responsibility to hold meaning gently, responsibility to recognize inherited patterns without being ruled by them. The sky does not belong to any one era, neither does the human response to it. Each generation receives the same vastness and responds in its own way, shaped by context but guided by ancient instincts. In recognizing those instincts, there is freedom. Freedom to choose calm over urgency, curiosity over fear. What remains is not a conclusion, but a posture, a way of standing beneath the sky that honors both knowledge and mystery. A way of remembering that the stories humans tell about celestial events are, at their core, stories about how they learn to live with scale, time, and continuity itself. That posture, once adopted, changes how the future is approached. Instead of anticipating disruption with anxiety, there is room for receptivity. The unfamiliar no longer arrives as a threat that must be resolved, but as a reminder that change has always been part of the human experience. The sky becomes less a source of concern and more a steady companion in this understanding. Across centuries, this posture has allowed societies to endure moments of uncertainty without losing coherence. When explanations were scarce, myth provided stability. When explanations became abundant, reflection took its place. Both served the same quiet purpose: to keep humanity oriented within forces it could not command. Events like 3i Atlas briefly illuminate this continuity. They do not announce a new era, nor do they close an old one. They simply reveal for a moment the long-standing dialogue between human perception and cosmic scale. Attention rises, meaning forms. Then gently, attention returns to daily life, carrying a subtle shift in perspective. This shift rarely announces itself. It settles quietly, influencing how future uncertainty is met. The next unfamiliar object will not be seen in isolation. It will be encountered by a mind already shaped by countless similar moments, each one leaving behind a trace of familiarity with the unknown. In this way, the human relationship with the sky is cumulative. It is built not from single events, but from repetition, from looking up again and again across lifetimes, cultures, and eras. Each glance adds to a shared internal archive, one that stores not facts, but ways of feeling. Myth was once the primary language of this archive. Today, it exists alongside many others. Science, philosophy, art, and quiet contemplation all contribute to the same task: helping humans remain present within a universe that vastly exceeds them. As this exploration draws closer to its final resting point, the emphasis remains on continuity rather than conclusion. There is no final story to tell about the sky, just as there is no final interpretation of human response to it. Both remain open, unfolding together. What endures is the ability to pause when attention lifts, to recognize the familiar rhythm, and to allow meaning to form without haste. In that allowance, the ancient impulse to turn celestial events into story finds its most peaceful expression. The sky continues, humanity continues. Between them, the quiet practice of reflection persists, offering steadiness where certainty is impossible and calm where vastness might otherwise overwhelm. That quiet practice of reflection reaches its fullest expression when humans accept that not every experience needs to be carried forward indefinitely. Some moments exist to recalibrate, not to be preserved. The sky offers these moments freely. They arrive, they pass, and they leave behind a subtle adjustment in how life is perceived. Ancient myths often preserved moments because preservation was necessary. Without writing, without measurement, memory had to be protected through story. Today, preservation is effortless. Information can be stored endlessly. What becomes rare instead is release, the ability to let an experience complete its work and then dissolve. This is where modern awareness can gently diverge from ancient necessity. Events like Three-Eye Atlas do not need to become permanent narratives to be meaningful. They can function as brief interruptions that restore perspective, then fade without loss. Meaning does not require permanence. It requires presence. This understanding changes the emotional tone of engagement. There is less pressure to decide what something ultimately signifies, less urgency to connect it to destiny or consequence. Instead, there is room to simply acknowledge the experience and what it stirred internally. In this way, myth evolves again. It becomes less a structure imposed on reality and more a movement within perception. The story happens quietly, inwardly, without demanding articulation. The mind recognizes the pattern and allows it to pass. This capacity for release is not indifference. It is maturity. It reflects confidence in continuity rather than fear of loss. Humans no longer need to hold every celestial moment tightly to feel oriented. The long relationship with the sky has already done its work. As attention returns fully to daily life, the sky remains overhead, unchanged by whether it is being watched. Yet something within perception has shifted. There is a deeper familiarity with interruption, a steadier response to the unfamiliar. This steadiness is not learned in a single moment. It is inherited across countless moments of looking up and wondering. Each one adds to a quiet internal landscape shaped by scale, time, and humility. As the final reflection approaches, what stands out is not the sky itself, but the human capacity to adapt to it, to find meaning without fear, to carry uncertainty without urgency, to let stories arise and fade without clinging. In this capacity lies a gentle confidence, a sense that humanity does not need the sky to explain itself in order to live beneath it. It needs only to remain attentive, reflective, and willing to release what has already fulfilled its purpose. That willingness to release completes the cycle. It returns the relationship between humans and the sky to its simplest form: observation without demand, awareness without urgency, presence without the need for conclusion. In this state, meaning is not something pursued, it is something allowed. For most of human history, the sky was never expected to answer questions. It was expected to exist, to move, to remind. Myths emerged not because answers were required, but because attention lingered. Over time, attention became story, and story became memory. Today, attention can remain just attention, informed by the knowledge of how stories form and why. This does not make modern humans separate from their ancestors. It places them in continuity, the same sky, the same instincts, a deeper awareness of the process, but the same underlying response. When something unfamiliar appears above, the mind still pauses, the heart still recalibrates, perspective still widens. The story of Three-Eye Atlas, like all such moments, does not need an ending. Its purpose was never to resolve anything. It was to reveal a pattern that has always been there. Humans notice the sky. Humans respond. Humans make meaning. Then life continues, slightly adjusted, quietly informed. In this understanding, myth is no longer something that belongs to the past or threatens the present. It is a companion to awareness, reminding humans how they have learned to live with scale, time, and uncertainty. It is not an explanation of the universe. It is an expression of relationship with it. The sky will continue to offer moments of interruption. Some will be noticed. Many will pass unseen. Each one carries the same potential, not to alarm, not to instruct, but to orient, to remind humans of where they stand within something vast and ongoing. As attention drifts downward once more, toward rest and routine, the sky remains, silent, indifferent, steady. And beneath it, humanity continues its oldest practice, looking up when needed, telling stories when useful, letting go when the moment has passed. This is why humans turn celestial events into myths, not because they misunderstand the sky, but because they are learning again and again how to live beneath it.